Okay, so this is the first Q&A we're doing ever. We got a decent amount of interesting questions, but since I'm in a rush this time around, I'm just going to get right to it. So, our first question is from Proto, and he asks, do we have any official, as in the Bible or any related texts, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, knowledge of the life of Jesus before his time with the disciples, and do we know what happened to some of the other ones, aside from Peter, after his death? In terms of official documentation, not much. There's an infancy gospel. I think it's the infancy gospel of Timothy or Thomas. One of the two. I get the two confused. That talk about Christ when he was a child and when he was learning. I personally don't think this is a topic of importance. A lot of people like to squeeze in some weird myth about Jesus being in India this whole time, or say that he stood in Egypt and he learned all these Hermetic traditions and all this stuff, and that's why he came back with this sort of Messiah complex. Most Christ childhood theories are just that. Ways to sort of discredit Christ and sort of turn his ministry into some new agey type nonsense. I would also argue that it's not in the gospel because it's just not important. If it were, we would have found it there. As for the second part of your question, we have it recorded from several sources that are inconsistent as to how each of the apostles died. The gist of it is they all died pretty terrible deaths. The majority of them were also crucified at crosses, on crosses at some point or another. I think a couple of them might have ended up actually being fed to lions. I do know that John had his head severed and delivered on a silver plate, which is where that famous line comes from. So, yeah, the apostles did not die happy deaths. So, Galosh asks, why do you suppose God wanted particular stones for the priest's breastplate? Further, how often are such stones used to represent the tribes or even the nations? Now, this is a bit of a complex subject because scholarship, even to this day, can't agree as to what the Hebrew words for the stones actually translate to. And so it's still a matter of hot debate. I do know, or at the very least, one can extrapolate, just from historical context, that each of the 12 stones likely represent some form of royalty relative to a culture surrounding the Israelites, meant to elevate the existence of the 12 tribes above the hostile pagan nations, is what my guess would be. He goes on to ask, in Revelations Apocalypse, why does God have a green or a light rainbow around himself on the throne? So the color green, not all the time, and this is something important to note with color symbolism, about, I want to say, 15 years ago, Egyptology went absolutely insane with color symbolism, and of course the New Agers took that ball and rolled with it. So color symbolism is not always there, but in this particular passage, the color of green is meant to symbolize life itself. So God is surrounded with a green light because he's the life giver. But it should also be noted that this green light is surrounded by a rainbow. So it's not that he's surrounded exclusively by a green light. It's just the green light is what comes out around God, and then there's a rainbow around that. How often does the jade August personage come up in Chinese culture, and do you think there is a link between these two figures. I actually had to Google that. I'm not that familiar with Chinese lore in particular. And after reading about it, it appears as though it comes up as the creator figure. And I would say that they don't really have a link, to be perfectly honest. That this is nothing more than a coincidence. And I say that mostly because if you look at the appearance of God in the Bible, he frequently does not show up with just light around him. In fact, there are points in time where he doesn't show up with any light whatsoever. He either shows up as a person or as like a burning bush. The wind at one point is God. We haven't gotten to that part yet. So the Jade personage only appears as one thing, whereas God appears as a multitude of things. So I honestly just don't think the two figures are connected. However, I am not going to fault someone for thinking that it might be a carryover of that idea. In other words, evidence of some lost form of proto-monotheism, and so that symbolism is connected. But again, that's only if you wish to think that. Johnny Zero asks, what part of the Torah do you find the most powerful or inspiring? Very good question. I would say I find God picking Moses as his first prophet to be the most inspiring part of the Torah. And there are a number of reasons for this. I mean, Moses makes all kinds of excuses for why it can't be him. You know, he says, well, you know, I've got this speech impediment, and then God gives him that, and, you know, I'm a weak man, and God gives him that. And the sort of read between the line message here in God's dealing with Moses is that you don't have to be a strong man to have strong results. You know, God doesn't care if you're, well, if God doesn't care if you see yourself as, say, a lesser individual or a loser, as many people would say in society. God doesn't care if you have a speech impediment or if you're shy in front of crowds, and that he prefers to use these weak aspects of society to show society the right way. There's actually a secondary or sort of connected area on this later with one of the prophets who decides to kill a group of people, and then God essentially fires him, but we haven't gotten to that point yet. So I think the story of Moses on a personal level is something that people can relate to. People can relate to his call to action even when he himself feels as though he's not capable of taking said action. So I would tell people to take from that in situations where you feel as though you're helpless, you're not, and you can most certainly do things about it. You just need to find the proper will to do so. Al-Marduk asks, are the Exodus plagues invoked in Revelations? Yes and no. This is another topic that has been of high debate among scholars for a long time. If you go to the book of Revelations, you can most certainly find, like, rivers turning to blood, locusts. I believe there's even a mention of frogs, if I'm not mistaken. I'd have to double check on it, but I'm pretty sure it's there. And of course, death, darkness. So, the plagues found in the book of Egypt might very well be in Revelations. Now, in the book of Revelations, there's no connection drawn between the activating of these plagues and the plagues found in Exodus. So whether or not that's intentional by the author, or if that's just a recurring motif, that's more up to personal interpretation. Maybe it's just God's favorite tools for destruction. Who knows? But the answer is yes, with an asterisk, but it's not really played off that way. And the second question, are the Jews subject to a mandate or weight as a consequence to their antecessors' actions? Kind of like how we carry the weight of Adam and Eve as humanity. Yes, actually, in the book of Deuteronomy, it goes over all of the curses put upon the Israelites before they enter the land. So we'll get to those. And the important part in that is that God picked this people. They said yes. So because they've said yes, if they do what they're actually supposed to do, they'll get blessings. And if they don't, if they turn away from him and rebel from him, it's cursing time. So we will eventually go over that. So Oddsbang wanted me to talk about infant mortality. And I'm going to try my hardest to be, I guess, delicate with this topic. A lot of people get upset, irregardless of whatever position you take. But to sort of cram it down, because this is a dense and complex topic that's filed more frequently under the problem of evil. We haven't reached Apologia section of the class yet. And that's assuming people actually want to take that class. The class might vote to study something else. Who knows? I do think infant salvation is absolutely true. I mean, it's from a logical standpoint, right? God can't really send someone who hasn't done anything good or bad to, quote, the bad place. Of course, we've gone over what the bad place really is. It doesn't really exist in the way a lot of people think. And so maybe we'll have to go back over that. A lot of people didn't seem to understand that completely, which is fine. I like to defer to what the old Jewish sages, the Chazal and the Beit Din HaGadol had to tell us on this topic, because believe it or not, they do touch on it. And they tell us that all humans, not just Jews, but all humans are born with a love for God on their hearts and Torah on their mind. And because of this, this makes human infants fundamentally innocent. It's only until we grow up that we forget about our love and we forget about Torah, and we have to relearn it through whatever channels or avenues are available to us. So I would say that when an infant is born, should it unfortunately pass, it's innocent and nothing wrong has happened to it. Now, as for why infant mortality happens to begin with, I mean, obviously there are a number of medical reasons and issues that can occur. Why would God allow such a thing to occur? You don't ask that, but I'm going to put that in this recording. Because it's important to note the two beside each other. I don't think God really allows anything to happen. He lets life exercise its free will. And free will means being able to suffer. It's a mixed bag of properties, is the harsh reality of things. You know? So I've always internally believed philosophically that disease represented the innate chaos of the universe, that in a universe that has the property of free will, such things would learn to evolve and such. But that's just my personal opinion on the topic. So, to recap, infant salvation is definitely real. Babies don't go to hell. That's kind of a horrible thing to say. I would say, however, that the Catholic rendition of if the baby's not baptized, then it's going to hell. I would say that that's an example of cruel doctrine, meant to scare people into practicing this form of thought. I mean, think about it. If you're a sincerely spiritual man and the church claims to be the representation of God and they claim this, well, then it must be true, right? So, yeah, there are a lot of poisoned well ideas on this because people use it to sort of take advantage of what people say. But again, deferring to the sages, we're all born with Torah on our hearts. And so, we're born innocent of anything. It's not until we learn the ways of the world that changes.